2009's Harpoon, sometimes also known, or sometimes known instead as the Reykjavik Whale Watching Massacre, markets itself as being essentially the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on a boat. And for some reason on the internet it's sometimes listed as a horror comedy. And that I really do not understand, because there is nothing comedic about this movie. It is a very serious and sometimes quite mean-spirited movie. And when I say mean-spirited, I mean that in the way that there are certain horror movies, especially monster movies, where you can go into them, have a lot of fun, even if you're not necessarily the kind of person that has a stomach for all things horror, but you can watch them anyway and enjoy them because they're maybe a little bit campy or a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and it's not all that serious, it's just a bit of monster fun. And I'm sure that you can think of some movies like that, movies which definitely are horror films, but people who aren't necessarily the strongest horror fans can still enjoy them. Then you have others which you probably wouldn't recommend to just anyone. And again, a horror fan will probably have some that come to mind. This, I would say, is slightly more leaning towards that latter camp. This is not a horror movie which I would recommend to someone who is only a light horror fan. If you consider something like The Thing, for instance, or The Blob, or movies like that to be horror, and about as far as you want to go into horror, then you probably shouldn't watch this one. Not that it's the kind of movie that will scar you for life, but it's a much more serious, less campy, less tongue-in-cheek, and, as I said, at least in my opinion, more mean-spirited twist on the horror genre. Now, being the Texas Chainsaw on a boat, that makes sense, because that movie is known for being one of the goriest films ever made, even though actually it isn't all that gory, especially by modern standards. This is a similar kind of film, and I can definitely see the similarities and why people would say it's kind of like that. Personally, I also thought it was a little bit like The Hills Have Eyes on a boat. And I must admit that the first time I watched this movie, I did not like it. And so that raises the question, why am I reviewing it? Because, as a general rule, I only review horror films, or films in general, which I believe people should see. Movies which deserve to be better known, especially in the case of these smaller horror films. So why am I talking about it? Well, the reason why is actually because I wanted to revisit this movie, to see if I'd done it an injustice, to see if I was maybe in the wrong mood for a movie like that. Maybe because I wasn't expecting it to be as mean-spirited as it was, it kind of took me off guard, and I didn't enjoy it as the tongue-in-cheek horror flick that I was expecting it to be. And I feel that that is probably the case, because having watched it now a second time and taking notes for the sake of this review, I did like it more. Now, to be clear, there are still certain aspects of this film which I don't like, certain things which, were I given the opportunity to change it, I would. Not necessarily big story points, because I like the way the story in this film pans out, it doesn't sugarcoat anything, but there were certain characters and certain interplays between characters which didn't really feel necessary, and more importantly, didn't feel justified. There are certain choices which people make in films, sometimes even in horror films, which you think, would that person really do that? Not necessarily things that are radically insane, not like the protagonist suddenly starts skinning everyone else. Of course not, that doesn't happen in this film, by the way, but things where you think, well, would they really have done that? Does that really fit the character? At least from what I've been shown from that character in the beginning of the movie. And I kind of got that feeling from this film, at least at certain points. And with one female character in particular, that was definitely the case. She's not a leading character, but she is one of the more prominent characters. Now, the basic plot and premise of this film is a group of tourists going on a boat to do some whale watching. It's in a region of the world, Reykjavik, where whale watching is now done instead of whale hunting, in effect, and the people who would have previously been the hunters of whales now are using their boats to take people out to these places and watch the whales and get paid for that instead, because of things like animal protection, Greenpeace, all that kind of stuff. But various little things happen here and there on the way, accidents, deliberate things, and a combination of both, which means that it doesn't exactly go as planned. And sometimes your rescuers aren't exactly the kind of people that you'd want to be with. And that, in a nutshell, is this film. It's a human-based horror. There are no big, scary, transforming monsters, nothing like that. There's no aliens coming down. It's just about crazy, mean people. And that aspect of the film works very well. Now, one of the people that horror fans will recognise in this film pretty quickly, because most of the people aren't that recognisable, there aren't really any huge name actors in the film, but one person who, as I said, horror fans will probably recognise is Gunnar Hansen, who of course played Leatherface in the original Texas Chainsaw. He is one of the villains in this film as well. The primary villain, if you will. And he is one of a family of three who are kind of the reason why I liken this film to The Hills Have Eyes on a boat. They're that kind of not quite right in the head and visually not quite right in some cases family of maybe cannibals, it would seem, potentially so. But in this case, instead of being in the hills, they're on a boat and they prey on whoever they can. That has a lot of potential. And there aren't a huge amount of films that play on that kind of premise. There are horrors on boats. Harbinger Down, for instance, is a fantastic homage to The Thing. And there are definitely some others as well, like Jaws, probably most notably. But this specific style of having crazy cannibals in boats isn't exactly a strongly used premise. And for that, I really respect the film. It is genuinely out there. It's not following the crowd, it's doing its own thing. That's cool. Now, as far as things that I did and didn't like, of course without spoiling anything, I like the way that this film looks. I like the colour grading, I like the fact that the colours are very washed out, it's a very bleak looking film. Even the boats that they're on, the ones that aren't necessarily piloted by bad people even, are pretty run down. They're rusty, used, old boats. Nothing looks clean and fresh. Even the people don't look clean and fresh. They look like just normal people who happen to be wearing whatever they were wearing that day and are just in this situation. And the characters, for the most part, are an interesting selection. There's quite an eclectic mix of likeable people, interesting people, perplexing people, and just straight up annoying people. And there are a fair amount of annoying people in this film, most of whom are used as fodder, as you'd expect them to be. And most of them you don't really feel sorry for when they go. But that's nothing new for horror films. You've got to have people to kill at the end of the day. Now, as far as stuff which I perhaps didn't like, I already touched on the fact that some of the character choices in particular that are made just don't really feel justified. They weren't built up, the characters weren't presented as being like that. As I mentioned, one female character in particular, and she is given some backstory. And don't get me wrong, the backstory that she's given is very tragic. Very brief, but very tragic. At the same time, though, that backstory doesn't justify the things that she does in the film. She's one of those totally self-preservation focused characters. And although on the surface of things you think, well, yeah, that makes sense. It does, but there are different ways that you can present that character. Usually that character will kind of be a comic relief as well. The idiot who somehow keeps on surviving. In this film, that's not the case. She's just a very snidey, self-preserving character who really has no basis for being like that in the film. She's not presented as being that way. There's just a certain point in the film where you can literally watch her face, and without exaggerating, you can literally pinpoint the second in the movie where she turns from being somewhat likeable, due to her backstory mainly, and suddenly becomes, well, let's just say very, very unlikable. And in some films that works brilliantly. They make some of the best villains. But in this film, she's not used as a straight-up villain. And as tragic as it can be to have people who are supposed to be the survivors turning on each other, and that works well as a story trope, you've got to justify that, as I said, and it just didn't feel justified to me. That was the primary issue that I had with the film. But apart from that, I like the fact that the film is its own thing. It's unique, at least to some degree, and it is quite a savage film. Now, I watched a version of the film. I don't believe I watched the uncut version. I don't know what differences there are, even if I did watch that one, between that and a normal version, because I haven't watched both. But as far as the gore goes, it's not hit and miss, but there are definitely varying levels of quality and believability there. Some of it is a bit more camp, not necessarily comedically camp, but more to the side of being camp, such as an overuse of blood squirting out of people's necks, that kind of stuff. And then other times there's some quite intense gore, such as a hammer to the head. That is done really well, but the mix between the two it has an upside and a downside. The upside is that it keeps you on your toes. You don't know if the next kill is going to be comedic or dead serious, and that's an interesting thing. It kind of has mixed emotions there, but at the same time, the disadvantage is ironically the same thing. It has no specific tone, and fluctuating between the two kind of means that it's not as comedic as it could have been, but it's also not as intense as it could have been, and you end up with kind of this 50-50 mix, if you will, that actually gets about 50% quality on either, instead of hitting a solid 100% on either comedy or gore. So that was a slight issue for me. I don't think it would be an issue for most people. Most people would probably like the fact that it's done both ways. Personally though, I just wish they'd chosen one and stuck to it. Preferably the more intense side of things, because the characters in the film, the visuals of the film, the bleak tone of the film all lend themselves towards being very savage and mean-spirited. And the effects and some of the way the characters are presented and saying certain things at different times adds in this kind of unneeded comedic aspect to it. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's not a comedy at all. And that's the weird thing, because the comedy doesn't really land. It's not awful, it's not cringy, but you don't really care about it. There's no response. You don't laugh, but you don't roll your eyes either. You just forget it. So it could have kind of done without that, at least for me. As far as other things which I did like though, I really enjoyed the soundtrack of the film. The opening credits of the film showing some real whale hunting footage, some of which wasn't nice to watch, and accompanied with some great music, some really nice, I believe it was violin work, if I remember correctly. Some really nice music opens the film. The music is revisited along with some more heavy metal inspired music here and there, and I like the soundtrack of the film very much overall. And speaking of stuff like the soundtrack, that kind of thing, that of course brings us to our individual scores. So first of all, we have the story and the plot, and for the story and the plot of Harpoon, I'm going to give it a 6, because the inconsistencies, which I mentioned, between comedy and a more serious tone, kind of held it back. I believe that this film, had it stuck, in particular to being more mean-spirited, could have been iconic. It could have been iconically savage. There's definitely the potential there. And I kind of wish that they had done that. They could have made this into another Martyrs, or Hostel, or Serbian film. It could have been that kind of film had they done it in a different way, and to be honest, I would have rather they'd done it that way. It would have certainly made the film more memorable, because you just don't hear people talking about this movie, whereas with those others that I mentioned, you do. So overall, I'm giving it a 6. It was well done, it was better than it could have been, but there were just some inconsistencies there, some missed opportunities, which kind of lowered the score a bit, at least for me personally. As far as the characters involved, the casting, the likeableness of the characters, or the greatness of villains, that kind of stuff, again I'm going to give it a 6, because they're a little bit hit and miss. Some of the characters you immediately can tell are just there for fodder. Other characters are cool. Some characters in particular are really cool. And there are certain characters who are totally different to what you're expecting them to be, and sometimes a lot more resilient than you might expect them to be, and that's all I'll say in that regard. But what they do with the characters is a lot better than what they did with the story. The story is pretty paint by numbers. The characters definitely aren't, the choices that they make, and I do admire them for that, even though some of the choices I didn't like. Hey, if you try something different, it's not always going to land, but at least they tried. As far as the visuals, the special effects, that kind of stuff, I'm going to give it a 7. And the reason why I'm giving it a 7 is kind of because of what I already mentioned earlier. I love the visuals, I love the washed out colours. It actually kind of reminded me of a British crime drama, or kind of mobster, gangster, street level kind of film. It had that look to it. It also kind of looked similar in the graininess to something like 28 Days Later, which I like that visual style. As far as the effects though, That's where it got, as I mentioned, a little bit more hit and miss, and that hurts the score a little bit. Overall though, I am giving it a solid 7. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, not just music, but sound design, sound effects in general, again I'm going to give it a 7, because I already mentioned I really liked the music that was used in the film. It really stood out, it's memorable, it sets the tone, a really great opening tone for the film. And so, yeah, I'm going to give it a 7. It's a pretty simple, easy score for that film. And finally, of course, the most personal to me, the most subjective, the rewatchability and entertainment factor. And for that, I'm going to give Harpoon, again, another 7. Because it's a movie which I think is kind of a Vegemite movie, or a Marmite movie, if you will, depending on where you live, in that if you are a horror fan, and to be honest, regardless of if you're a Texas Chainsaw fan or not, this is a movie which has a very much 50-50 chance of being either something which you will really like, or something which you won't care for. Because even for me personally, I've swung both ways. I did not like it the first time, I liked it more the second time. So I really think that this could be one of those films which is definitely not going to be universal in its love or hate. Certain people, I think, will love this film, especially if you haven't checked it out yet, maybe you haven't heard of the film, and it could be, for some of you, like a hidden gem. I really feel this is that kind of film for some people. For others, though, maybe they'll be underwhelmed by it, maybe just won't care for it, maybe like me on their first viewing, they'll find it a little bit too mean-spirited or inconsistent in tone. But overall, I kind of like that. I like the fact that the film has that 50-50 slant and you can kind of go either way. And overall that means that as a tabulated score put together of all 5 categories, I am giving Harpoon, aka the Reykjavik Whale Watching Massacre, a pretty respectable, not overly high, but definitely respectable 3.3 out of 5. And of course it goes without saying that if you have the opportunity to check out the film, you might want to search different names because it can be difficult to find. But if you do want to check it out, if you get the chance to, I would recommend doing so if you are a horror fan and you fancy trying something a bit different, something that's not talked about as much, and a film which potentially you might either really like or really not like. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.